first cosmonauts and astronauts were launched into space, and then I began to dream about maybe that would be the ultimate experience for a pilot.
Most people know Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin from Apollo 11. Very few know the voice guiding them from mission control belonged to Charles Duke. In 1969, he served as CAPCOM during humanity's first moon landing, while the lunar module descended with fuel running dangerously low. 3 years later, he became the youngest person to walk on the moon during Apollo 16. And what he experienced on the surface was not the version of the moon most people imagine from photographs or footage. It was beyond what the human mind could interpret in real time. Behind humanity. Charles Duke was the voice inside mission control during Apollo 11. In July 1969, while millions of people watched a grainy television feed of a spacecraft approaching the moon, Duke was one of the few people in the room who understood exactly how fragile the situation was. He was serving as CAPCOM, the capsule communicator. In NASA's structure, that role was strict. Only one person was allowed to speak directly to the astronauts. Mission control itself was not the clean, quiet command center that later documentaries would turn it into. Engineers filled the room shoulder to shoulder. Every number mattered. Every change in fuel, velocity, or trajectory was tracked in real time. As the lunar module descended toward the surface, the atmosphere in the room narrowed into silence. People stopped speaking unless they had something essential to say. The only voices that cut through were the flight controllers calling out data, and Duke relaying information to the crew above the moon. Neil Armstrong was manually guiding the lunar module during the final descent. The onboard computer had taken them toward a landing area filled with large boulders. That area was not safe. Armstrong had to take control and steer the craft away from it while still dropping toward the surface. Every correction used fuel. Every second reduced their margin for error. When it reached zero, the mission would not fail in theory. It would end in a crash on the moon. He called out the remaining time in steady intervals, relaying updates as the spacecraft burned through its reserves. At one point, he delivered a message that would later become part of Apollo history in its own indirect way, telling the room that they were running extremely low and that tension was building across the team. When the lunar module finally touched down and confirmation came through, the room did not immediately erupt. The reaction was delayed, almost uncertain, as if people were processing the fact that the numbers had stopped changing, and the spacecraft had actually survived the descent. For Duke, that moment created something that stayed with him. He was the person who helped guide the first successful landing on the moon, but he was not the person who stepped onto it. He stayed on Earth listening through a headset while someone else walked on a surface no human had ever touched. That separation mattered to him. The public image of Apollo 11 belonged to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Their names became history. Their images became symbols. Duke's role remained behind the scenes, but he had seen the mission from a position of extreme proximity. He understood the pressure, the risk, and the reality of what it took to land there in the first place. That experience did not fade after Apollo 11 ended. It grew into something more focused. Duke went through NASA's astronaut training program with the same goal that many of his colleagues shared, but for him it carried a specific edge. He was not satisfied with being the voice guiding others. He wanted to be the person on the surface. That path, however, was not direct. At one point during his time in the astronaut corps, Duke was assigned as backup crew for Apollo 13. During that period, he came into contact with a group of people at NASA and accidentally exposed them to German measles. This forced NASA to replace the prime crew member, Ken Mattingly, just days before launch. The situation created one of the most difficult crew reshuffles in Apollo history. When Apollo 13 launched, Duke remained deeply involved from mission control, and when the oxygen tank exploded during the mission, he spent long hours supporting the recovery effort from the ground. He was part of the team working to bring the astronauts home safely after the failure turned a routine mission into a survival problem. That experience connected him directly to the reality of how quickly spaceflight could turn dangerous. Apollo missions were not just planned journeys. They were systems operating at the edge of what engineering could sustain. Eventually, Duke's own opportunity arrived. He was assigned to Apollo 16 alongside Commander John Young and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. the same astronaut who had been removed from Apollo 13. The mission launched in April 1972, heading toward the Descartes Highlands, a region that had not been explored in detail. NASA believed this area might contain volcanic features. That assumption shaped part of the mission's scientific goals. The crew was expected to confirm volcanic activity and collect evidence supporting that theory. But reaching the Moon itself introduced immediate uncertainty. After separating from the command module in lunar orbit, Apollo 16 experienced a serious issue with its main engine system. That engine was critical for maintaining orbit and ensuring a safe return home. If it failed completely, the crew would be stranded. Mission Control paused the landing sequence. Duke and Young remained in orbit for roughly 6 hours while engineers on Earth analyzed telemetry data and debated whether the landing could continue. During that time, they were physically above the lunar surface, looking down at terrain they might never reach, waiting for a decision that would determine whether the mission continued or ended in orbit. The landing was eventually cleared using modified procedures. Apollo 16 descended toward the surface and landed near its target area, missing it by only a few hundred meters. That precision mattered because it confirmed that manual adjustments during descent could still achieve a controlled landing under difficult conditions. At that point, Duke became the 10th person in history to step onto the Moon. But from his perspective, the experience was not defined by ceremony or symbolism. It was defined by the environment itself. Layer of distortion. The first thing Charles Duke noticed on the lunar surface had nothing to do with geology, equipment, or mission objectives. It was the sky. There was no sky in the way the human brain expects one to exist. Above him was pure black. Not dark blue, not dim, not faded. Black even in full daylight. On Earth, the atmosphere scatters sunlight and creates the blue color of the sky. On the Moon, there is no atmosphere at all. Light does not spread or soften. It travels in straight lines, hits a surface, and stops. That single difference changes everything a human eye is trained to interpret. Stars were not visible in most directions. The sunlight reflecting off the lunar surface was so intense that it washed out everything else. The result was a visual field where bright areas dominated completely, and anything outside direct light disappeared. Then Duke looked down at the ground and saw the second problem immediately. Shadows were complete absent. On Earth, even the darkest shadow still contains detail because light bounces through air and fills in edges. On the Moon, shadows behave like cutouts. When something enters shadow, it stops being readable to the eye. Equipment disappears. Shapes lose definition. There is no gradual fading from light to dark. There is only visible and not visible. This creates a specific kind of confusion for the brain. Depth perception depends on gradients of light. Without them, distance becomes harder to judge. Objects that should feel close can look flat. Slopes that seem gentle can hide steep changes in elevation. The horizon added another layer of distortion. It appeared closer than it should have been. The Moon is much smaller than Earth, and that curvature changes how distance is perceived. Craters and ridges did not behave like normal terrain. Some looked flatter than they were, others looked more distant than they actually were. The landscape constantly forced the eyes to correct their assumptions. Duke later described this effect in simple terms. There was no wind moving across the surface. The environment did not carry sound because there is no air to transmit it. Everything depended on direct mechanical contact or the internal systems of the suit. Inside the helmet, Duke could hear only a small set of consistent sounds. His own breathing, the steady operation of the oxygen system, the occasional clicks and shifts from the suit as he moved, and the radio link to Mission Control. At certain moments, even that radio link would pause. When it did, the environment became something humans almost never experience naturally, just visual information without any auditory support. Movement added another layer of difficulty. The Moon's gravity is about 1/6 of Earth's, which means every step behaves differently. Instead of walking, astronauts often moved in controlled hops that had to be carefully balanced. The spacesuit itself restricted movement further. It was pressurized, rigid, and designed to protect life in an environment that would otherwise kill a human instantly. Turning the head was not simple. To look around, Duke had to rotate his entire body. Nothing on the Moon allowed casual movement. Even looking up came with limitations. The helmet design and suit posture made it difficult to angle the head freely. This meant that Earth, which people often imagine as hanging clearly in the lunar sky, was not something he could easily observe from the surface in the way most mental images suggest. The body position required for exploration made upward viewing awkward and often impractical. This directly contrasts with one of the most famous images associated with space exploration, Earth rising over the lunar horizon. That view exists, but it was not part of Duke's everyday visual experience while working on the surface. His reality was more constrained, more physical, and more task-focused than the cinematic version people often imagine. All of these factors combined into a single realization that became impossible to ignore. Nothing about the moon behaved in a way the human brain is designed to interpret without effort. The moon was not distant or peaceful in experience. It was visually unstable, physically restrictive, and mentally demanding in every direction at once. NASA was wrong. Apollo 16 was planned as a precision science mission, not a historic spectacle. On paper, it did not carry the same public weight as Apollo 11. It was designed to test geological theories, collect samples, and confirm what scientists already believed they understood about the moon. That assumption did not survive contact with the surface. The landing site was the Descartes Highlands. Before the mission, NASA's working theory was that this region showed signs of ancient volcanic activity. The training Duke and John Young received reflected that expectation. They were taught to recognize volcanic rock formations, lava flows, and surface structures that would suggest internal geological activity shaped the area over time. Once they arrived, that model stopped matching what they were seeing. The terrain did not behave like volcanic ground. Instead, the rocks they encountered repeatedly pointed to something different. The samples were not consistent with cooled lava or volcanic deposits. They were fragments of broken material fused together under extreme pressure and heat. These are known as impact breccias. They form when high-energy collisions break rock into pieces and weld them back together during massive impacts. The more samples they collected, the clearer the pattern became. The moon was not showing evidence of internal volcanic shaping in that region. It was showing evidence of repeated, violent external impacts. That shift changed the scientific meaning of the mission while it was still in progress. Instead of confirming a stable geological history driven by internal heat, Apollo 16 was revealing a surface shaped by constant bombardment. The moon was not a slowly evolving world in the way Earth is. It was a record of collisions, preserved over billions of years without erosion, atmosphere, or water to erase them. One of the most important samples collected during the mission was a large rock later named Big Muley. It weighed nearly 12 kilograms, making it one of the largest lunar samples ever returned to Earth. Its structure and composition helped confirm the impact-based model of lunar formation. It showed signs of extreme antiquity, with origins dating back billions of years, and it became a key reference point for understanding the moon's early history. What made this discovery significant was not just the size of the sample, but what it replaced. Scientists had expected Apollo 16 to strengthen volcanic explanations of lunar highlands. Instead, it removed that expectation entirely from the region they studied most closely. Apollo 16 also carried out scientific work that received far less public attention than the landing itself. Duke and Young spent more than 20 hours on the lunar surface conducting exploration and experiments. They drove the lunar roving vehicle across rough terrain that had never been mapped in detail. They collected a wide range of rock samples from different locations, each adding more data to the same conclusion about the moon's violent history. One of the lesser-known achievements of the mission was the deployment of a small ultraviolet telescope directly on the lunar surface. This instrument allowed observations of space in wavelengths that are blocked by Earth's atmosphere. It was the first time astronomy had been conducted from another planetary body, opening a completely new observational window for science. Each of these tasks added to the same underlying realization. Apollo 16 was not just visiting the moon. It was revealing that earlier assumptions about it were incomplete. By the end of the mission, the scientific picture had shifted in a clear direction. The moon was not primarily a volcanic world that cooled and stabilized over time. It was a body shaped by repeated impacts, locked in a geological record that Earth had long erased through weather and tectonic activity. The contrast between expectation and observation defined the mission. NASA sent astronauts to confirm one version of the Moon. Apollo 16 returned evidence of a different one entirely. Killer Moon. Before any scientific discovery or historic achievement mattered, Apollo 16 operated under a more immediate condition. Survival was not assumed. It was actively being maintained every second. The Moon did not behave like a distant, quiet surface waiting to be explored. It functioned as an environment where small failures had immediate consequences. That reality became clear even before Duke and John Young reached the surface. After separating from the command module in lunar orbit, Apollo 16 experienced a serious malfunction in its main engine system. That engine was essential for controlling orbit and returning the crew safely back to Earth. If it failed to restart at the correct time later in the mission, the spacecraft would not be able to leave lunar orbit. Mission Control paused the landing sequence. For roughly 6 hours, Duke and Young remained in orbit above the Moon, while engineers on Earth reviewed telemetry data and debated whether to continue. During that time, they were not moving away from the surface. They were circling it, watching the same terrain pass beneath them, fully aware that the decision being made on Earth would determine whether they would land or return immediately. The concern was not limited to landing. The deeper risk was return capability. Even a successful landing would mean nothing if the ascent engine later failed to lift them off the surface. That meant every stage of the mission carried a hidden layer of risk that most viewers never think about. Getting to the Moon was not the end point. Leaving it was equally uncertain. Once the landing was cleared, the environment itself became the next source of danger. Temperatures on the lunar surface exist at extremes that remove any sense of stability. In direct sunlight, temperatures can reach approximately 127 degrees Celsius. In shadow, they can drop to around -173 degrees Celsius. There is no atmosphere to soften or distribute that heat. There is no gradual transition between hot and cold. Conditions change instantly depending on whether a surface is illuminated or not. Exposure is not survivable without protection. The suits were the only barrier between life and immediate environmental failure. But temperature was only one part of the problem. Lunar dust created another layer of risk that was less visible but constantly present. The surface is covered in fine particles formed over billions of years of impacts. Without wind or water to smooth them, these particles remain sharp and irregular. They behave like microscopic shards of rock. When disturbed, they float and cling to everything through electrostatic charge. During surface activity, this dust-coated suits, tools, and equipment. It scratched surfaces. It worked its way into joints and seals. It entered the Lunar Module when astronauts returned inside, carrying it into an enclosed environment designed to sustain human life. Once inside the spacecraft, the dust did not behave like ordinary soil. It stayed suspended longer than expected and spread through contact. Astronauts reported irritation in their eyes and lungs after exposure. The smell, once brought into a pressurized oxygen environment, was described as similar to spent gunpowder. From orbit, the Moon looks smooth and quiet, a gray, almost uniform surface. Up close, it behaves differently. Gravity on the Moon is 1/6 of Earth's gravity, which sounds like it should make movement easier. In practice, it creates instability. Every step carries momentum that is difficult to control. Instead of walking normally, astronauts often moved in controlled hops that required constant correction. During one moment of activity, Duke attempted a jump in low gravity and lost balance. He fell backward onto his life support backpack. The equipment on his back contained the systems that kept him alive, including oxygen supply and pressure regulation. A rupture or serious damage could have ended the mission and his life within minutes. Getting up again was not simple. The suit was rigid and pressurized. The backpack shifted weight in a way that made recovery difficult. Every movement had to be calculated, even after a fall. That incident revealed something important about the environment. Even basic actions carried consequences that were not forgiving. Nothing on the Moon allowed unconscious movement. Every motion had to be intentional because there was no margin for error. Across the entire mission, that pattern repeated itself in different forms. Exploration was physically exhausting. The suit limited flexibility. Vision was constrained. Communication depended on radios that could fail. Even small mistakes could escalate quickly. By the time those realities became familiar, a clearer understanding of the environment had already formed. Apollo astronauts were functioning inside an environment where survival had to be actively maintained at all times, and without that awareness, even brief moments of exploration would not have been possible. Charles Duke. For Charles Duke, Apollo 16 ended when he returned to Earth and realized that nothing around him matched the scale of what he had just experienced. The crew had landed safely, completed scientific work, collected samples, and returned home without loss of life. But the internal transition was not simple. Earth felt different afterward. Routine life no longer carried the same structure or intensity. Apollo had demanded constant focus, strict precision, and a clear sense of purpose. Every decision had been tied to survival, mission success, or failure. After returning, that structure disappeared. The pace of normal life felt smaller and less defined in comparison. That shift affected more than routine. Like many Apollo astronauts, Duke faced difficulty adjusting to the separation between what he had experienced and what everyday life required. The mission had consumed years of training and focus. When it ended, there was no equivalent replacement for that level of purpose. That strain extended into his personal life as well. Relationships that had been placed under pressure during training and mission preparation did not immediately return to stability after the flight. The demands of Apollo had taken priority for years, and the transition back required adjustments that were not immediate or easy. Over time, Duke began searching for meaning outside of his technical achievements. That search eventually led to a spiritual transformation that he has described in interviews as more significant in personal terms than the experience of walking on the moon itself. He did not describe this as a rejection of science or exploration, but as a change in how he interpreted what he had already seen. The view of Earth from space and the experience of standing on the lunar surface had already altered his sense of perspective. Earth appeared isolated, fragile, and without visible borders from that distance. The moon itself was a place where human assumptions about environment and stability did not hold. Over time, those observations shaped how he thought about existence, responsibility, and human limits. In later years, Duke also became a public voice in discussions about Apollo's legitimacy. When confronted with claims that the moon landings were fabricated, he responded directly and without escalation. In one exchange, his reply was simple: "Sir, I was there." His position relied on both personal experience and physical evidence. The Apollo missions left measurable and verifiable traces behind. Lunar samples returned from the surface are still studied internationally. Retroreflectors placed on the moon are still used to measure the distance between Earth and the moon using lasers. Rover tracks and astronaut footprints remain on the surface because there is no atmosphere or weather to erase them. These elements formed the foundation of his response to skepticism. For Duke, Apollo was not a narrative constructed from images or recordings. It was a set of physical events that left permanent, testable results behind. At the center of his personal memory of the mission is the family photograph he placed on the lunar surface. The photo was sealed in plastic and left in the Descartes Highlands during Apollo 16. It carried a handwritten message identifying it as a family from Earth. Over time, exposure to radiation and extreme temperature cycles likely faded the image until it became difficult or impossible to visually recognize. Despite that, the object itself remains on the moon. It is still there, in the same place it was left. That detail connects the technical achievement of Apollo to something personal. A scientific mission that returned geological samples and experimental data also left behind a human artifact that was never meant to be recovered. Today, Duke is one of the few remaining people who have walked on the lunar surface. With each passing year, that group becomes smaller. The number of living witnesses to Apollo continues to decline, and with it, direct human memory of what the missions were like. Eventually, the moon will remain known only through records, samples, and physical artifacts left behind. The surface itself will not change. The footprints, rover tracks, and the family photograph Charles Duke left behind will remain where they are, preserved in a place where nothing moves, nothing erodes, and nothing disappears the way it does on Earth.